In 2017, I was 26 years old and had just rented a small one-bedroom apartment on the 8th floor of an older high-rise in Cleveland, Ohio. The building wasn't fancy, peeling paint in the hallways, an elevator that sometimes rattled a little too much, but it was affordable, and it was mine. For the first few days, everything felt normal. I unpacked my boxes, set up my kitchen, and tried to make the place feel like home. The apartment above mine was on the 9th floor, and on the first night I noticed heavy footsteps pacing back and forth overhead. It didn't really bother me. I figured it was just a neighbor settling in after work. But the footsteps didn't stop. Every night, usually after midnight, they grew louder, almost deliberate. It wasn't the random sound of someone walking around their home. It was slow, heavy pacing from one end of the apartment to the other. Sometimes I'd hear a sudden thud, like someone dropping something heavy right above my ceiling. I told myself it was fine. Old buildings carry sound differently, and maybe my upstairs neighbor just had an odd schedule. Still, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, it was impossible not to notice how steady those footsteps were. Back and forth, back and forth. By the end of my first week, I had memorized the pattern. I couldn't fall asleep until the pacing stopped, and sometimes it didn't stop until nearly dawn. I had no idea then that the footsteps were only the beginning. After the first week, the noises started to change. At first, it was just the footsteps, slow, heavy, dragging from one side of the ceiling to the other. But soon new sounds joined them. A chair scraping across the floor, something metallic being dropped. Sometimes it was so loud I'd sit up in bed, heart racing, convinced my ceiling was about to crack open. The worst came at exactly 2 a.m. Almost every night, I'd jolt awake to the sound of dishes shattering. It was always the same, the crisp, sharp crash of plates or glass slamming against the floor, followed by silence so thick I could hear my own pulse in my ears. Each time, I waited for more noise. A neighbor cleaning up, a broom sweeping. But nothing followed. Just the faint hum of the refrigerator in my own kitchen, and those long, steady footsteps starting again overhead. By the third night of it, I pressed my ear to the ceiling, straining to catch any voices. Nothing. Not a word. Just walking, dragging, then that unmistakable shatter again at 2 in the morning. The lack of explanation was worse than anything else. If I'd heard arguing, or even a TV playing too loud, I could have blamed it on inconsiderate neighbors. But the silence, broken only by these violent crashes, made my skin crawl. I tried earplugs. I tried music. But every night, at exactly 2, the plates fell again. I couldn't explain how I knew it was dishes, but the sound was so distinct, so real, that I could almost picture shards scattering across a floor I'd never seen. By the end of the second week, I wasn't just losing sleep. I was starting to feel like something upstairs wanted me to hear it. After nearly 2 weeks of broken sleep, I finally decided I couldn't just lie there listening anymore. If my neighbors upstairs didn't care that they were keeping me awake every night, then I'd have to say something. It was just past midnight when I climbed the stairs to the 9th floor. The hallway was darker than mine, only one of the fluorescent bulbs buzzing weakly overhead. I found the apartment directly above mine and knocked firmly on the door. At first, nothing happened. The silence stretched so long that I almost turned to leave. Then, just as I raised my hand to knock again, the footsteps started above me. Slow, heavy, deliberate, echoing across the ceiling I'd been staring at for nights. My throat went dry. I knocked harder this time, calling out, "Hey, could you keep it down? It's the middle of the night." No answer. The footsteps continued, steady as ever. I knocked again, louder. The sound carried down the empty hallway. Still nothing. No light flicked on inside, no voice through the door, no shuffle of someone coming to answer. Finally, I pressed my ear to the wood, listening. The apartment was silent now, completely silent. I stood there for nearly a minute, heart hammering in my chest, before finally giving up and heading back downstairs. The next morning, still groggy, I stopped by the leasing office to complain. The manager behind the desk glanced at me, then quickly away. "Just try to ignore it," she said, her tone clipped, as if she'd heard this all before. When I pressed her, she repeated the same thing, refusing to look me in the eye. I left more unsettled than before. If the noise was just normal neighbors, why did it feel like no one wanted to talk about who lived above me? A few days later, I got my answer, though not the one I wanted. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was coming back from the grocery store juggling bags up the elevator. When the doors slid open onto the 8th floor, an older woman stepped out of her apartment just down the hall. She was small, maybe in her 70s, with sharp eyes that studied me as I fumbled with my keys. "You're new here," she said, her voice calm but firm. I nodded. "Yeah, just moved in a couple weeks ago." She hesitated, then added, "How are you sleeping?" The question caught me off guard. I laughed awkwardly, shifting the bags in my arms. "Not great, actually. The people above me, they're up all night, walking around, dropping things. I even went up there once, but nobody answered." Her expression darkened. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "There is no one above you." I froze, unsure if I'd misheard. "What do you mean? It's the 9th floor. I hear them every night." She shook her head. "That apartment's been empty for years. Everyone hears them at first. We all think it's just noisy neighbors until we find out the truth. That place hasn't been rented since before you came here." I stood there stunned, my grocery bags suddenly feeling too heavy in my hands. She looked at me with something like pity, then added softly, "Most of us learned to live with it, until we couldn't anymore. You'll see." Before I could ask more, she retreated back into her apartment and shut the door. For the first time, I realized the footsteps and the crashes weren't just bad neighbors. They were something else entirely. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. Every creak from the ceiling above made my heart jump. I lay awake staring at the plaster, waiting for the next sound. At 2:13 a.m., right on schedule, the crashes began again. First, the sharp clatter of something falling, like a plate smashing against tile. Then heavy, dragging footsteps, moving slowly from one end of the apartment to the other. I buried my head under the pillow, but it didn't help. The footsteps grew louder, deliberate, almost as if whoever or whatever was up there wanted me to hear. I couldn't take it anymore. The next morning, I marched upstairs. Apartment 902 looked just as it had before, a plain gray door, dust gathering around the handle. I knocked harder this time. My fist echoed down the silent hallway, but no one answered. I pressed my ear to the door and held my breath. For a moment, I swore I heard faint breathing on the other side. When I pulled back, the air around me felt suddenly cold, like I'd stepped into a draft. That was the moment I knew. I didn't care if I lost the security deposit or had to live out of boxes. I couldn't stay there. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. Every creak from the ceiling above made my heart jump. I lay awake staring at the plaster, waiting for the next sound. At 2:13 a.m., right on schedule, the crashes began again. First, the sharp clatter of something falling, like a plate smashing against tile. Then heavy, dragging footsteps, moving slowly from one end of the apartment to the other. I buried my head under the pillow, but it didn't help. The footsteps grew louder, deliberate, almost as if whoever or whatever was up there wanted me to hear. I couldn't take it anymore. The next morning, I marched upstairs. Apartment 902 looked just as it had before, a plain gray door, dust gathering around the handle. I knocked harder this time. My fist echoed down the silent hallway, but no one answered. I pressed my ear to the door and held my breath. For a moment, I swore I heard faint breathing on the other side. When I pulled back, the air around me felt suddenly cold, like I'd stepped into a draft. That was the moment I knew. I didn't care if I lost the security deposit or had to live out of boxes. I couldn't stay there.